2010, he completed 5 years of mentored research training through the National Institute on Drug Abuse through the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry K-12 research program in substance abuse. He is a medical director of an adolescent substance treatment program and an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Colorado. His federally funded research focuses on developing better treatments for adolescents with substance abuse and on the impact that medical marijuana legalization has on the youth. Dr. Thurstone is a team physician for the Denver Broncos, and in June 2012, the United States Congress awarded him another title, U.S. Army Major. He is honored to provide mental health care as part of the 807th Medical Command. In October 2012, Dr. Thurstone was one of 9 people nationwide named Advocate in Action by the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. This award recognizes his research and advocacy of evidence-based prevention that furthered the president's national drug control strategy. So, now that I've given you a laundry list of all of his accomplishments, I'll introduce him to the stage. Here's Dr. Christian Thurstone.
Okay, good. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me. Can you hear me okay? Is the mic working? And thank you for your patience and for enduring the cold weather and for me to be here and talk with you. I'm a child psychiatrist. I'm an addiction psychiatrist. I run an adolescent substance abuse treatment program for adolescents, young adults, and I'm an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Colorado. And it's been a very interesting time in Colorado in terms of we've had this basically a de facto legalization of marijuana in 2009. And so it's been a really kind of a wonderful place to be a researcher in the field of adolescent young adult addictions, to just see what happens when you legalize this. It's kind of been a very nice experiment in some ways. And so the title of my talk, I changed things at the last minute, and a plea for reefer sanity, just to talk about some of the data that I've been collecting in Colorado and to share that with you, and also trying to do something positive and to also suggest maybe an agenda and a policy for moving forward that I think would be good for youth, good for public safety. So that's what my agenda is today, and I'll save some time. I was going to talk well, we're getting a late start, so I'll condense it today, maybe for about 30, 40 minutes, and then have time for discussion and questions afterwards. Sound good to everybody? Sorry my remote isn't working tonight, but so I just want to say right off the bat, the drug war is over. Did anybody know that's over? It's been over for 3.5 years, and this is the new policy here moving forward, a 21st century drug policy. And this is put out by the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and which is part of the White House, part of the Obama administration. And they've taken a new tact on this in terms of ending the drug war and really promoting a science-based public health policy around this that's compassionate, prevention, treatment-oriented. So science-based in terms of we want to use evidence, research, science to inform the decisions that we make going forward. A public health approach, we're trying to protect vulnerable populations like adolescents and innocent people, auto accidents, crime, things like that. We're trying to maximize the benefit there. Compassionate in terms of we're trying to not, lock people up for minor amounts of marijuana possession, or moving forward in terms of trying to get people access to medicine. We'll talk about this more, that might help them with their pain, their suffering. Moving forward with prevention and treatment, really expanding prevention. The best substance treatment is really tough. About 30% of the adolescents I see get completely clean by the end of treatment. And then of those who do get clean, 60% relapse in the first 6 months. So the best treatment really is prevention. So really working on increasing prevention as well as access to treatment. And at the same time, looks like it got cut off here, but it's all these things and a restrictive drug policy. So still trying to decrease supply and restrict supply as well. So it's all these things and restrictive at the same time. And on the website there, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, they have the whole PDF, or they have the executive summary if you want to just read the Cliff Notes version of it, of a 21st century drug policy. So that's kind of where I stand, not in terms of my understanding is that from history that it's President Nixon who really kind of started this war on drugs, right? And I don't know if people here are old enough to remember the whole Cheech and Chong movies from the 70s and 80s. And so really, I think a lot of the problem in the discussion about marijuana has been this false dichotomy, this black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking, that we have this all-out war on drugs or we have this all-out legalization here. And I think what we're trying to do really is it doesn't need to be this way. There's a third way about this, and it's what I just showed you, the third way really being this science-based, public health, compassionate, treatment-oriented, and restrictive policy moving forward. So moving on then, in terms of, I've been collecting a lot of data recently on the impact of outright legalization of marijuana in Colorado and how it affects, being a child psychiatrist, I'm very interested in how it affects young people. But really when you talk about marijuana and marijuana policy, you can't help talking about young people because young people are so disproportionately affected by marijuana in terms of, I'm going to get into it more in terms of, for example, 60% of all new users of marijuana every year in the United States are under the age of 18. And young people have a developing brain, and they can become addicted much easier, and they have long-term consequences from their use. So I'm going to talk more about that in a second. So like I said, 60% of all new users of marijuana, there are 2.4 million new users of marijuana in the United States every year, and about 60% of them are under the age of 18, and that comes from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health that's published every year. And of those who try marijuana, if you're an adolescent, you try it before the age of 18, 17% of those go on to develop a marijuana addiction. And so I should just stop for a second. There's a whole kind of thinking out there. I think it's a myth in terms of marijuana isn't addictive, or if it is, it produces a psychological addiction but not a physical addiction. And that's, among the scientific medical community anyway, there's no longer any debate about that in terms of marijuana being not just psychologically addictive but physically addictive as well, in terms of producing tolerance, having a withdrawal syndrome that's pretty well characterized and an important part of the clinical picture of it. If somebody tries marijuana after the age of 18 for the first time, there's a 4% chance that they'll go on to develop an addiction. So it's much less if we can prevent young people from starting. So why is that? We used to think that the brain was fully developed at age 6 and boom, you're done. And we kind of know that the brain is its full size pretty much by about age 6, but we know now that the brain is really going through tremendous growth and maturation until about the age of 24. And so what's happening in the brain during that time is important. So there's a structure right here. It's called the Brain Reward Center. And it starts here with the ventral tegmental area, goes to the nucleus accumbens. All drugs of abuse increase the amount of dopamine right here in the nucleus accumbens. So, and that's how we feel pleasure. And so this part of the brain was originally probably designed to respond to food or sex or anything that's pleasurable. Just so happens that all drugs of abuse have this same effect. They all increase the amount of a chemical called dopamine right here in the brain. So whether you're talking about nicotine or heroin or cocaine or amphetamine or marijuana or whatever anybody can get addicted to, it all has the same downstream effect here. This part of the brain is mature by about age 13. Now, 13-year-olds have an adult ability to feel pleasure and want to do risky things and get rewards from that. Now, this part of the brain right here is called the prefrontal cortex, and that's really important for judgment, thinking ahead, kind of putting the brakes on things. So this is the gas pedal right here, and then these are the brakes right here. And this part of the brain doesn't fully develop until about age 24. And so I'll tell you why that's important in a second. But basically, you have this period in adolescence where you really want to do pleasurable things, but the brakes aren't fully developed to put the brakes on that. And so that was probably a good thing in past societies where it was really important for adolescents to leave the home, go get a mate, do their own thing, take some risks. And then it just so presents some challenges in our society now in terms of increased vulnerability to becoming addicted, in the case we're talking about tonight. Now, I also want to highlight here all these little pink dots everywhere in the brain are their CB1 receptors or cannabinoid 1 receptors. And they're very diffusely located throughout the brain, and they're the most common receptor of its type. So for those studying biology, it's the most common G protein receptor in the brain. And it's located a lot in the brain reward circuit here, in the prefrontal cortex, really important for memory, judgment, thinking ahead. This is the hippocampus right here, really important for learning and memory. And so we found that animals exposed to marijuana in adolescence during the time when their brain is really developing have permanent deficits in their learning and memory, and their hippocampus, if you slice it up, is quite different than animals not exposed to marijuana in adolescence. You see a lot of pink dots in the cerebellum, really important for balance, coordination, things related to driving, for example. So it's thought that this CB1 receptor that marijuana binds to plays a really important role in this brain development process that adolescents are going through, and young adults too. And what's happening during that time is getting rid of a lot of connections that are no longer needed, number one, and number two, developing little fat cells called melanocytes around the nerve cells that make the electrical impulses travel more efficiently. So those are two main things happening in adolescence, and it's thought that this CB1 receptor plays an important role in controlling that brain development. And it just so happens that that CB1 receptor is also what marijuana binds to. So you have this developing brain on your hands, and the thought is that kind of moving parts are more likely to get broken, basically. And so kind of a similar concept in terms of when a woman is pregnant, she's typically very careful about even taking a Tylenol or something. So kind of a similar concept in adolescence. When you have this developing brain, you want to be really careful what you're adding to it because it might have some permanent results down the road. So just going through that, this is a very hot field and developing literature around all this. So a couple points about this. Adolescent marijuana use predicts 2 to 4-fold increased risk of psychosis. And now this sounds like complete reefer madness, and the initial authors who did this study, Andreasen et al., 1987, so they did this study 20-some years ago. It was a study of about 65,000 Swedish soldiers, and they found that those who used marijuana or were exposed to marijuana as adolescents compared to those who weren't had about actually a 4-fold increased risk of having psychosis. So psychosis, like hearing things that aren't there, seeing things that aren't there, having delusions, fixed false beliefs that people, the community as a whole, don't share. And so they thought, this is something weird happening here. How can this be, right? And since then, 7 more studies have all had the same finding here. And if you put them together, about a 2 to 4-fold increased risk of developing psychosis with adolescent exposure to marijuana. And they've controlled for different things that maybe could be a confound. So, for example, maybe these people had psychosis at baseline, and that's why they had psychosis at follow-up. Well, they controlled for that. maybe the research subjects were intoxicated at follow-up, and maybe that's why they had psychosis. Maybe they used other substances that caused this. Well, they've controlled for these things statistically, and we keep having this. Over 60 variables they've controlled for now, and we keep having this finding here. So stay tuned with this. This is a whole developing body of literature, and I can say clinicians, this is a case of science really catching up with what we've known clinically for a long time in terms of we see this frequently as clinicians, and it sounds like reefer madness. It sounds funny. People have laughed at me about this, but it's really not at all funny for the families that are going through this. So let's see here. That's the picture of psychosis. The second point here that we need to talk about is adolescent marijuana use predicts up to an 8-point drop in intelligence. So the story on that is there have been various studies, starting with animal studies, exposing adolescent animals to marijuana as adolescents. So mice and rats go through their adolescent years, day 20 to 30 of life, and then you can expose them to marijuana or placebo, let them grow up to adults, and then see how well they make it through a maze, see how quickly they learn where the platform is in the tub of water for crawling out of the tub of water. You can see how they interact with other animals. And so researchers had found for years, actually, that these animals that were exposed to marijuana as adolescents were more anxious as adults, that they had decreased learning and memory as adults. And so in adults, or in humans, it's very difficult to study the psychosis thing and the IQ thing because, it would be so unethical for me to divide the room in half here. Okay, you guys are going to be on marijuana as adolescents. You're going to be on placebo, and we're going to see who gets brain damage, right? You just can't do that study. It's A, unethical, and B, I think that very few parents would sign their kids up for it. And so it's kind of, this is as good as we're going to get in humans, really. We'll never be 100% sure of a causal relationship, like marijuana exposure in adolescence causes this. We're never really going to be able to say that for sure. But so this is as good as we're going to get. But this study was in the papers here recently, so I don't know if you saw it. It was a study that was done in New Zealand, and they followed 1,000 consecutive births in this town, Dunedin, New Zealand, from birth to age 38. And they assessed people's IQ at age 13 and then again at age 38. And they assessed how much marijuana they were exposed to adolescent, young adult years. And theoretically, your IQ at age 13 is supposed to be equivalent to your IQ at age 38. Well, what they found was that those who used heavy marijuana in their adolescent, young adult years had a drop in their intelligence. And it was dose dependent. What does that mean? That means the more they were exposed to, the greater the drop in their intelligence, which is what you would expect if it were a causal relationship. And for the heaviest users, their drop in IQ was up to 8 points. And they ruled out other possible causes as contributing to this. So, for example, they controlled for other substance use, they controlled for mental health problem, they controlled for educational achievement, and they still had this finding. They also ruled out, so they took people who stopped using marijuana at their 37th birthday or approximately and assessed them as well. And if they were exposed to marijuana as adolescents, they still had this IQ drop that we're talking about. So stopping using at least a year before the testing didn't bring them back to their baseline IQ. So that was an important finding, and so stay tuned on that. I think that's part of what's exciting and so timely about all of this, and why I'm excited everybody's here, is that a lot of the studies I'm telling you about are less than 2 months old right now. So it's an exciting time to be in this field. So then there's, even if marijuana has no biological effect on development and brain development, there's still the social effect that it can have. So we know that teenagers, young adults are going through a really critical time of social development. And so we've known from another study that was conducted in New Zealand of over 6,000 research subjects followed from about birth until their early 20s, that the kids who waited until they were 18 to try marijuana for the first time, or they never tried it, were 4 times more likely to finish high school and 4 times more likely to get a college degree than those who started using by their 15th birthday. So that was another important finding. And educational achievement and success is such an important prognostic indicator for health, quality of life, many other things. And then this is an interesting finding here. It has to do kind of with the gateway hypothesis here. And everybody's been saying, it's been disproven, and so I believed that for a few years. And then I said, well, why don't I just look it up, do the literature search on this, and I found about 10 to 15 studies, same finding that no, around the world over tens of thousands of research subjects, that marijuana use in adolescence confers about a 2 to 3-fold increased risk of using other drugs in adolescence, young adulthood. And that's been done around the world and controlled for other factors. And it's thought that I think the big question about this, though, is it a social cause? Like, kids who know where to get marijuana are more likely to know where to get other substances? Or is it something biological, like you're going through the brain development, you're getting rid of connections you don't need? If you're using these addiction connections, then do you respond more favorably to other substances? And it turns out it's probably a combination of both factors. It's partially a social cause and then maybe partially also a biological cause around that. So those are some data around this. Now, in Colorado, I think we've known this for decades in terms of the story of tobacco, and I think there's a lot to learn from the story of tobacco in terms of really targeting young people, trying to develop the new users. We know that 99% of adult smokers started smoking before the age of 18. We know that youth are just much more vulnerable to becoming addicted to substances. We know that, according to Newsweek that just came out this week, 80% of the profits from alcohol and tobacco companies are made by heavy users, so not the casual users. So if you really want to make a profit, you're really going to have to target the young people who can become your heavy users. People don't wake up in their 40s and 50s and say, I'm going to start using drugs now. It just doesn't happen very often. So this here is, there's a medical marijuana dispensary right here behind the plant. And this man works in the dispensary, and on Saturday mornings they do free bike repair for people riding their bike down. This is a very busy street right here in Denver. And so I think it's just an interesting kind of subtle way, maybe not so subtle way, to really target youth in your advertising, your marketing. I think a young person is much more likely to be riding his or her bike down the street than, somebody my age would probably be more likely to be driving their car. Other, kind of not so subtle advertising. This is from Kush Magazine, Colorado, Kush Magazine, Denver. And really, we know from the story of tobacco, alcohol, marketing towards young adults is marketing to adolescents, really, because adolescents, they don't want to grow up to be old. They want to grow up to be kind of young adult types, right? So this clearly targeting young males. And 70% of the people on the medical marijuana registry in Colorado are males. And so maybe I should just stop for just a brief second, too, to make sure it's clear in terms of how medical marijuana works in Colorado. Basically, somebody can go to a physician. The physician has to make a recommendation, sign a form saying that they're recommending marijuana to you, and then you can submit your form to the state agency, and then you get this, it's called a red card that you can take to a dispensary, and you can buy marijuana there, or you can grow it yourself, or you can designate somebody else to grow it for you. And what happened in 2009 was suddenly became very easy to get this medical recommendation. If you had $100 or so, you could just go in and say your foot hurts, right? There were 5 doctors making 50% of the recommendations. There were 12 were making 80% of the recommendations, and at one time we had 3% of the adult population in the state on medical marijuana, and that's gone down to just over 2% now. But that's what I say when we've had de facto legalization of marijuana. really it's been very easy if you wanted to go it legitimately to really go out and get the recommendation and then start accessing marijuana. And from what my patients tell me, at least, that's no longer even really needed in many cases to actually have the red card. You can still just access it anyway. But having said that, okay, this is kind of where we are now. And then you see here also in terms of, ring pots. Chiba Chews are the little candies that are made in Denver and are medically infused. There's Butterfinger. These are the sodas. The sodas are made in Denver as well. The Pot Tarts. And so this is kind of where we're at right now. And it's... But the truth is, I mean, if this isn't marketing and advertising to children, then I don't know what is, really, right? I mean, in the mid-1990s, there was Joe Camel, the cartoon, right? And 60% in the mid-90s, 60% of 3-year-olds could draw a line from Joe the Camel cartoon to a pack of cigarettes, right? And so no longer, cigarette companies can't use cartoons anymore in their advertising because it appeals too much to children. So, but medical marijuana can do that. These are some data that we collected in our adolescent substance treatment program where I work. And we asked our kids, have you ever obtained marijuana from someone with a medical marijuana license? Sorry, you guys can't see, so I'll explain it to you. And half said yes and half said no. And when we compared those saying yes to those saying no, those getting medical marijuana reported marijuana was easier to get. They reported their friends were less likely to disapprove of marijuana. They were more likely to report daily marijuana use. They were more likely to report more severe marijuana dependence. We have since replicated that study, and actually it's gone up now to 74% of kids in our substance treatment programs are accessing medical marijuana. So that's gone up from 50%. But those are kids who are in substance treatment. Maybe they would be using marijuana anyway, right? So we went to a pediatrician's office and surveyed kids there. Have you ever gotten marijuana from someone with a medical marijuana license? And about 18, so almost 1 in 5, 18% said yes, and 82% said no. So still pretty prevalent, even in a general population of kids going to their pediatrician for sports physical or vaccination. And when we compared, 36% said they knew someone with a medical marijuana license. And so when we compared those knowing someone with a medical marijuana license, those not knowing someone with a medical marijuana license, those knowing were more likely to use marijuana, more likely to say it was easy to get, more likely to say their friends didn't disapprove of using it, more likely to say it wasn't harmful. So just kind of consistent with the hypothesis that this is maybe having an effect on kids. School expulsions for drug use are published by the Colorado Department of Education. And again, we're really interested in this 2009 time period here. Right here, before and after 2009. So right during that time period, we had a 40% increase in the number of school expulsions for drug use in 1 year. So that was really concerning, and people were hoping that would just be an anomaly, a one-time exception. But if anything, it's continued to go up. Last year, it dipped a little bit. Hopefully that's a true dip, although we're skeptical it's a true dip because of budget cuts. The school resource officers' positions have been cut within the schools, and we think schools are just kind of not reporting it as much. But hopefully it's a true dip anyway, but it's still much above the level where we were at in 2008. So this is a table here, and let me just walk you through it. It's the best data we have in terms of, okay, what's the impact on substance use if you really legalize something on kids here? And so let me just walk you through it. We have on the top here 2005 to 2011, the different years, and then we have the different surveys here. So the Youth Risk Behavior Survey is Colorado as a whole. And Colorado as a whole has been pretty stable, 22% to 25, back to 22. People who are really, for legalizing marijuana have said that, wow, see this drop here from almost 25 to 22%? You should have more medical marijuana. You should have more marijuana legalization. And the fact is, I think it's a little bit more complex than that. A couple things about that are that these are kids in school. This is a survey of kids in school, and I just finished telling you how we're expelling more and more kids for drug use and marijuana use, number one. Number two, this change is not statistically significant. So every poll, right, in the presidential race, they talk about the margin of error. So this is still within the margin of error here. It's not considered statistically significant decrease. And right here, boom, in 2010, 100 communities across the state, basically most of the state, got rid of the commercial distribution of marijuana. So all those Chiba Chews and everything and the medical marijuana centers that do the advertising, all 100 communities across the state got rid of that in 2010. And so that may be a really important confound as well. Now, Boulder and Denver and Adams County are in Denver metro area where 60% of the medical marijuana patients are, 60% of the medical marijuana dispensaries are located. We have 517 licensed medical marijuana dispensaries in the state. And so it could be kind of interesting to try to compare, Denver metro to the state as a whole. And so what you see with Boulder, you see Boulder having, small increase possibly. I don't know if it's within the margin of error. They didn't publish it. But definitely it looks like it might be higher than the state as a whole. 25% of kids using marijuana in the last month compared to 22% using marijuana in the last month in Colorado as a whole. Denver, the only data we have is 2011. And 29% of high schoolers reported using marijuana in the last month in Denver, and that definitely looks higher than the state as a whole. Adams County, also in Denver Metro, reporting large increases in past month marijuana use among adolescents pre-post 2009, and looks to be much bigger than the state as a whole. So I think the bottom line, if it was hard to see if you're over here, that it really looks like Denver Metro, where the concentration of medical marijuana is, commercial distribution of marijuana, the youth are using it more there than in the rest of the state. We did some other data here. These are about 160 adults in substance treatment at my hospital, and we asked them a lot of questions, but just I think 3 that I'm going to share with you here. 12% said marijuana is safe or unsure for kids. They're safe or they were unsure if it was unsafe for kids less than 13 years of age. Almost 40% saying marijuana was safe or unsure, or they were unsure if it was safe for teenagers 13 to 18 years old. 28% reporting they were safe or they were unsure if it was safe to use marijuana in pregnancy. And when we compared those with a medical marijuana license to those not with a medical marijuana license, those with reported marijuana was safer in significantly more safer in pregnancy than those without a medical marijuana license. So clearly lots of room for growth. And I think there's been a lot of confusion around this. I have parents come in to treatment and they say, hey, should I just get my kid a medical marijuana card so he doesn't get in trouble? Or, a lot of kids coming to treatment now, it's going to be legal in 2 weeks anyway, why would I want to stop? So I think there's just been a lot of, it's hard to get good information out there right now. Kind of similar to when in tobacco days. So 9 out of 10, there were advertisements, 9 out of 10 doctors agree that smoking this brand of cigarette is safer for you than that brand of cigarette, right? Those were common advertisements when we were growing up. So legalization, less good for auto safety. So I think this is another important area too. I mean, there are some innocent populations here. There's adolescents, and then there's the whole public safety auto accident issue, I think, where people are affected. And also, and they kind of overlap as well. The leading cause of death for 15 to 20-year-olds is auto accidents. So what's happened in the state around this? On this axis, the y-axis, we have the number of traffic fatalities. where the driver was intoxicated with marijuana. And we have the different year here. And again, we're really interested in 2009 when we really had our de facto legalization of marijuana, where anybody could really just go in and get it. And we see basically it's doubled here since 2006, the number of traffic fatalities with an intoxicated driver. And this has been a real issue in the state, too, in terms of assessing drugged driving with marijuana is very difficult in some ways. There's not a breathalyzer, and there never will be a breathalyzer. Just physiologically, the marijuana's in your lungs for 15 minutes, and then it's gone pretty much. You have to do currently get a drug recognition expert to come out and do like a clinical exam, take somebody's pulse, blood pressure, assess their eyes, how's their balance, coordination, how are they talking, and that's how you diagnose and determine drug driving with marijuana now. And you can see how that's kind of subjective. And in terms of the having a per se limit equivalent to alcohol 0.08, we just haven't really been able to agree on that, what the per se limit should be, or if there even should be a per se limit. Some people have proposed 1 nanogram per milliliter of whole blood. Others have proposed 5 nanograms per milliliter of whole blood. The problem is a chronic heavy user could be at 5 nanograms per milliliter of whole blood THC for about a week after stopping using. And so there's lots of complexities around this driving issue. And similar thing too in terms of this is the number of drug recognition expert evaluations that were positive for marijuana, and they've also doubled, going from about 300 to almost 600 since 2005, again right pre-post this 2009 time period. And granted, we have more DRE expert evaluators out there in the field now, so that could be accounting for some of this. But nevertheless, it appears. And there's also a myth out there that driving under the influence of marijuana is okay and it's really not unsafe. And when in fact we know that having a 5 nanogram per milliliter blood level of THC confers about a 4 to 6-fold increased risk of being involved in a traffic accident. And we know that if you get somebody high with marijuana, put them in a driving simulator, their attention, their reaction time is just not what it was before they were intoxicated. We know it's impaired. And so while driving under the influence of marijuana is probably not as bad as driving under the influence of alcohol, it's still not a good thing. Okay, so we need to dispel that myth also. And here's just the data on driving under the influence there. So I'm not convinced that legalization solves the issue of drug cartels. So here, this is recently, about 6 weeks ago in Colorado, there was the biggest processing of a marijuana grow operation in state history, and it was over 13,000 plants. It was about a $24 million grow operation, and these are some pictures. I got to tag along with the people who went down there to process it. But so you can see here, I was just struck right off the bat, if you legalize this, why are we still having drug trafficking organizations from Mexico having, bigger grows here than we've ever had in the past, right? So I thought we weren't supposed to have that, number one. And number two, I was really struck by the environmental impact of this in terms of, you can see beautiful aspen trees that they had, cut down a lot of them to make more sunlight for the plants. You could see trash was everywhere. It was just acres of trash like this. And it was interesting too in terms of we found the water source, and then you could see how they irrigated from the water source, but also had put in pesticides into the water source to help their plants. But of course, it kills everything downstream in the water source. So I was impressed by that. So tax it, make a lot of money out of it. What have we found here in Colorado around that? Unfortunately, last year with medical marijuana in the state, there was a $5.7 million shortfall in the money needed to regulate medical marijuana. And so that was $5.7 million that had to come from the general budget than to regulate medical marijuana. And the most of the general budget's made up of schools, money for health care. So that was money basically for schools, health care, that then had to go to regulating medical marijuana. And so I think what we've really seen in the state is kind of a real privatization of the profits and a socialization of the costs. And in our current amendment, it calls for making sending the first $40 million of taxes on marijuana to, so we're voting in Colorado right now to legalize marijuana outright, and it's 50-50 right now whether or not it'll win, but it's calling for the taxes from that to go for to schools, the first $40 million. The catch with that, though, is that it doesn't actually raise a tax. We're going to have to go back and vote on it, on the tax. And if tobacco, alcohol are any example of this, there will be a big fight to vote to go back and tax it. So really, if we do legalize it, that'll be a real privatization of the profits and socialization of the costs. So I just want to finish here. You guys have been very patient, and I appreciate it. On just again reemphasizing this kind of third way approach, that we really don't have to have an outright drug war. We really don't have to have outright legalization. We can have a third way that actually has been the policy for the last 3.5 years with the Obama administration. And it's very, again, really emphasizing science and evidence. That's one reason I've tried to, stick to the facts as much as I can tonight and really try to convey, the latest science around this, and public health that really protects innocent populations, really trying to get more prevention and treatment out there, because prevention, treatment work. We know addiction's a brain disease. It's not some moral failure, something like that. It's really looking at it from a medical model. And something that's compassionate in terms of really not locking people up for minor offenses, for small possessions, really trying to strive for, if you have a ticket. So in Colorado, for example, getting a ticket for marijuana possession of less than an ounce is a $100 ticket. So nobody's being arrested anyway in Colorado, at least, and I don't believe in most of the United States anyway for minor possession of marijuana, but I think there's a misconception around that. And at the same time, still a restrictive approach, because when you really open up the floodgates like we've done in Colorado, you can get a lot of unintended consequences like that. So ONDCP, Office of National Drug Control Policy, has some great information, and then I have I have good information on my website there as well, and a lot of links. And with that, I'll finish up. And I think, do we have time for? Are you moderating? Are we time for questions or discussion? Okay, we'll have some maybe 15 minutes or so of questions. Is that okay? All right, sounds good. Any questions or comments, concerns? Oh, we have microphones.
Yeah,
set
if you
up
guys
for
have
this.
questions,
Cool.
just come make a line over here behind the microphone.
All right.
I have
So
a
we
question.
Yeah.
Okay, so in your chart, you were showing a chart that was talking about the drug driving,
Right.
and the fatalities have gone up. Do you have any proof that shows that's actual people driving under the influence of marijuana and not just under the influence of some type of drug?
Right. It's a great question. So question is, any proof that this is people driving under the influence of marijuana and not other kind of drugs? So yes, these are data from the Colorado Department of Transportation. So there's the website right there. And these are all blood confirmed cases. And it's not cases, it's marijuana only. So if you include marijuana plus alcohol, it would be a much different graph. It's a good question.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some different ways to maybe make it harder to get a medical marijuana license where it's still legal, but doctors aren't just handing it out for every, minor ache and pain.
Right.
Like they have to do more tests, get more certification.
Right.
etc.
That's a great question. So We've tried to, with Senate Bill 109 in Colorado, we tried to make it so doctors have to have a bona fide doctor-patient relationship. They have to offer follow-up appointments, really trying to tighten that up. Unfortunately, it hasn't done that in terms of tightening it up. I think there are a couple things that I would recommend. One is, I think the commercial distribution of marijuana really drives the profit motive. So some of these doctors are making $1 million a year just recommending marijuana, right? According to the Denver Post, some of the dispensaries are making $10,000 a day. So if you really get rid of that, if you just rely on, for the first 8 years of our medical marijuana experience in Colorado, we had a caregiver model. So you had to grow it yourself, or you could designate a caregiver to grow 6 plants for you. We had no commercial distribution of marijuana. So the Iowa proposals would have the dispensary model, but that I've seen. But I think if we went back to that, I think that would do a lot of good, that pure caregiver model. And under that model, there was not a single complaint that somebody couldn't access marijuana if they really wanted it. Now, I think the ideal situation would be to there's a medicine coming out. It's already available in Canada, in many parts of Europe. It's called Sativex, and it's an oral spray of THC, one of the active ingredients in marijuana, and cannabidiol, another ingredient in marijuana, that kind of makes the marijuana less addictive, less kind of toxic, less harsh than straight, pure THC. And anyway, so that spray, I think we should push for that to be available on kind of an exception basis before it has its final FDA approval, which should happen in about a year or two. And I think that'll really change things. So if states can, A, wait till Sativex comes out, and B, we can really push for more availability of that medicine on a special case basis, I think that gives people medicine they can use and benefit from, protects kids, protects public safety, is my opinion around that.
You mentioned, sorry, I don't like talking in front of people. You mentioned addiction and withdrawal. Could you give me a physical and cognitive withdrawal symptom?
Right, that's a great point. So can you give me physical and cognitive withdrawal symptoms? So 60% of teens in substance treatment for marijuana, by the way, so 67% of all substance treatment admissions for teens are for marijuana across the country. 20% of all substance treatment admissions are for marijuana. Marijuana is the second most common reason people come to treatment. 60% of people in treatment for marijuana addiction have withdrawal, physical withdrawal to marijuana. And that's very similar to nicotine withdrawal. So it starts at about day 2 and ends by day 14, maxes out about day 3, 4, 5. The symptoms are irritability, restlessness, decreased appetite, insomnia, mild tremor, sweating are at least 6 of the symptoms of marijuana withdrawal. It's one study reported by research group down in Arkansas reported that 50% of adults addicted to marijuana who tried to stop reported marijuana withdrawal as their reason for relapsing. So we know it's also a clinically significant, it's not just kind of this theoretical construct, it's a clinically significant concept that, and another group did a study of comparing nicotine withdrawal to marijuana withdrawal, finding them to be about equivalent. So we're up to about 10 studies now very clearly documenting marijuana withdrawal syndrome in adolescents, in adults. The new Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, coming out in May, will include cannabis withdrawal as a formal diagnosis.
You had mentioned before in one of your examples the medical marijuana dispensary in Denver advertising like having your bicycle looked at. Right. Would you say that the demographic of college students at public and private universities in Denver and Boulder affects the demographic of high school adolescents or younger adults purchasing or finding other people to purchase medical marijuana through?
Right. Yes, I think it's a great point in terms of would I say that the demographic of having college students in Denver, Boulder helps drive how much marijuana and marijuana dispensaries there are. And I would say absolutely. If I were a businessman, I would absolutely have my medical marijuana dispensary near, high schools, community colleges, universities. It's like I said, 60% of new users are under the age of 18. If you move that up to, the early 20s, I mean, virtually all new users are, in their early 20s or less. So I think absolutely that's related.
Okay, it's not just me. I have people who are too scared to come and ask their own questions.
Sure.
So, while you're looking at me, sorry. The first one is, do you believe that bad kids actually migrate to weed because it's illegal and other drugs because of no goals, motivation, good home life, things like that?
All right. Do I believe that quote-unquote bad kids migrate towards weed because it's illegal, basically? Is that the question?
Well, yeah. Do you believe that they migrate towards it because it's illegal and
Right.
they don't have other goals or motivation, things like that?
Oh, okay, because they don't have other goals and motivation. Okay, great question. So I'll tell you what I know about that, and we'll see if it answers the question. So I don't believe that on the whole that having something illegal makes things more appealing to youth. On the contrary, prevention science shows us that the less available something is, the less likely kids are to use it. The less acceptable it is, the less likely kids are to use it. The more harmful it's perceived to be, the less likely kids are to use it. And we know from the story of tobacco, alcohol, in terms of, kids use a lot more alcohol than they do marijuana. So on the whole, I don't believe that kids are attracted to it just because it is illegal and like kind of a rebellious thing to do. Now the second part of the question is really good in terms of we do also know that there are lots of protective factors for kids that protect them from getting involved with substances. And so absolutely, pro-social activities, sports, chess club, spiritual development, involvement in religious activities, what else? Connection to school, positive connection to peers, positive connection to family, all very protective influences on kids. So I think that answers maybe the second part of the question.
She's not telling me. Okay, this is my last one. Sorry.
Which, can I just, one thing in terms of if people who are struck by anything I say tonight, there's lots of opportunities for, like I said, kids want to grow up to be young adults, like most of you guys here. And so anything you guys do that gets you involved in mentoring or drug prevention is a great thing, right? It gives kids stuff to do that isn't drug related. So, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, this is the last one. As a cancer survivor, I'd just like to ask you, what do you don't think that marijuana has a big, like a good effect for people who are suffering through chemo and things like that? Do you not believe that it should be used for those things either?
Right. Okay. So, as a cancer survivor, do I think that marijuana is not a good thing for people going through chemo? So I will say in terms of that I'm not aware of a single study of people with cancer using marijuana to help them with chemo. So we do have some case reports and some very sincere, genuine stories around it. Okay, and but no medical data around that. So we have 10 randomized placebo-controlled studies of smoked marijuana for various medical conditions. So, for example, in the case of cancer, that's not really been studied, but they have given people, there's one study in which they've given people Ipecac, so that's something that makes you nauseous and want to throw up, and then you can give them marijuana or placebo and see if it helps with the nausea. And so this is a study of about 10 patients. And marijuana was better than placebo for helping with the nausea, but not better than Zofran, which is a widely available medicine that's used in cancer chemotherapy. And so just from the medical data, everything is risk-benefit, right? And so my personal opinion would be the risk to kids, public health, not greater than the benefit to people. Now, having said that, I think that, like I said, we need to do more in terms of making the medicine Sativex, which is taking some of the active ingredients of marijuana, putting it into a genuine medicine spray that will be sold in a legitimate pharmacy. We need to do more to make that available to people with cancer and who could use it on a compassionate basis. We absolutely need to do that. But I don't think we need to have medical marijuana to help these people. Okay, hopefully that answers the question. Yes, sir.
All right. So I noticed during your presentation that you busted a lot of the common myths of marijuana, and I was wondering, in any of your research, did you ever find any mortality rates with such marijuana? Or basically, have you actually found like combinations of marijuana and some other substances?
Right. So in terms of any of the research on marijuana and mortality rates around that, is that the basic question?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so our research group is actually looking at it. We have a sample of an 8-year longitudinal study, and we're analyzing this right now. And right off the bat, we can tell there's more mortality among our adolescent marijuana users and in young adulthood. But around this, maybe I'll just take this last question here, and then we'll... definitely there's a connection with increased risk of accidents. Also, about a 400% increased risk of having a heart attack in the hour after smoking, as well as respiratory infections, other health complications. One thing I didn't talk about is in terms of sexual risk-taking, marijuana seems to, we just published a paper on this, really affect people's decisions around using safer sex and using condoms during sex. And so I think, yeah, clearly there's a lot of mortality and issues around this. Maybe one more question and then we'll stop. I don't know if people are getting restless or not. All right, go ahead.
All right. How do you feel about alcohol, the legalization of alcohol, and how does a model of cannabis that's similar compare?
Right.
How would you compare those two?
I think that's an excellent question. And for example, the legalization of marijuana campaign in Colorado is called Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol. And so don't get me wrong, I'm not proposing to go back to banning alcohol. But at the same time, I'm not proposing to outright legalize marijuana. I think there are some important differences just in terms of, for example, in the past month, about 80% of adults used alcohol in the past month, whereas it's about 6% of adults used marijuana in the last month. So I think there's a big difference there in terms of culturally the role that it plays for us here. Having said that, too, I think alcohol is kind of actually a nice... You'll notice how many times I said alcohol and tobacco. I think they're very nice models for us in terms of, well, tobacco is the leading cause of death in the United States and has been for years. Alcohol is the third leading cause of death in the United States and has been for years. And so you really see we pay a big price for having these things legal, number one. And just one other point, and then I'll take your point again. And then number two, alcohol, tobacco taxes pay for a tenth of their actual social cost. So I think there's pros and cons to everything. But go ahead.
How would you compare the adverse physical effects of alcohol and nicotine
Right.
with the physical adverse effects of non-smoke cannabis?
Right. Comparing the adverse effects of alcohol and nicotine versus adverse effects of cannabis. And I think it's a good question, although in a way I think I can't answer it because what one person gets addicted to and what destroys one person's life, right, is not what destroys somebody else's life. So I think it's really, I don't know a good way to compare apples and oranges like that. I know that in the whole campaign right now to legalize marijuana in Colorado, there's been it's been stated over and over and over, marijuana is objectively safer than alcohol. And I think I'd like to dispel that myth because I don't think we can compare it. I mean, I don't know how you could really do a study that compares the two. I mean, in some ways, alcohol destroys one person's life and marijuana destroys somebody else's. So I think I don't have an answer. I don't know how you would design a study around that. It's a good question. Okay, well, thank you very much. I'll stick around after if people want to talk. Thank you.